many benefits to being a faceless YouTuber. The privacy and the knowledge that you don't have to worry about a bunch of strangers commenting on whether or not you made your bed that day are the standouts, but my personal favorite is that I can just set up my equipment, record my voiceover, meow into the microphone a few times, and then disappear into the night. It takes a bit for everybody else to get the memo, though. If you want to meow into a microphone, you must have Kitty. If you must have Kitty, you have to design him first. And that, dear viewers, is precisely what we're going to be going over today. How I came up with and designed my channel mascots, and what the process was like for iterating upon both of them. And maybe I might even have some tips to be able to share with you. So, starting off, we have Nostalgia. This handsome fellow is what I like to refer to as my more versatile Zona. While he has the more complex design out of my two channel mascots, he's also the one with the most unique and distinguishing traits, which makes him a lot easier to be able to change or swap out depending on how I want to draw him that day. I first designed him for one of my many original projects that hasn't quite made its way onto the larger internet yet, but you can already see his two most distinguishing traits popping up in his two soft first appearances on my channel. Light purple hair, a varsity bomber jacket that is relatively easy to draw, and, curiously enough, black and sclera, which is something that admittedly is shared across a lot of my personal OCs. If I have any distinctive sort of brand, it is Friday Nights at Freddy. I've been very open with the fact that working on the Penumbra Phantasm video caused me to have to overhaul a lot of the art design on my channel, and that is for, simply put it, one specific word: consistency. I wanted people to know at a glance when a video was specifically being made by me, and admittedly the easiest way to do that is to have a channel mascot slapped onto the thumbnail. I was already pretty confident with the vibes that I was getting when I was designing Ghost for the first time, so I decided to sit down and just spend a bit iterating specifically on what I wanted his specific look to be. And I knew that because the biggest video he was about to be featured in, and many of the others before and after, were going to specifically have pixelated art styles in them, I decided to follow suit. Translating a character I admittedly hadn't fully nailed down the design for yet into a completely different art style was tricky. It admittedly took me a little bit to get used to the change, and you can notice right away that I ended up omitting a lot of details from the finalized design. Things seemed to be heading in a better direction when I put him right next to Chris Deltarune and kind of carved my way into figuring out the Deltarune art style from there. I figured it was best to marry the character with the visuals that I was already planning on using, and if I wanted to end up drawing him in my own art style later, that was a change that would be very simple and easy to make. And it would just be Future Max's problem to figure out. Over the course of a week of spriting, my boy slowly began to emerge. But there was one thing that kept nagging at me. How do I make him look like he's an adult? Undertale and Deltarune admittedly have a very easy visual divide when it comes to children and anyone else. All you really gotta do is slap a bunch of stripes on them and make them like 20 pixels tall. But the divide between teenager and working adult is a bit trickier, especially when you throw characters like Burger Pants into the mix. Keeping one eye constantly covered seemed to help, and I tried taking off his jacket and just have him tied around his waist, but that didn't really feel right. And that's where we get into my first tip: consult other characters. If you're designing something with a series in mind, what makes that character feel like it's part of a larger cast? Are there any distinct visual traits or design choices that you can borrow or modify to make something look a bit more cohesive? For Nose's case, I had already nixed his paws on an earlier design to just give him normal shoes. but that had resulted in a rather stiff standing sprite, which is a problem when that is 90% of the sprites that he has already. I had done the cardinal sin when designing a full body character. I had neglected to realize what the bottom half would look like, resulting in something very boring. I knew I had to fix this. But thanks to the lovely people at the Spriters Resource, I was able to use that to pull up and look at every single sprite sheet that any of the Deltarune characters had. And I specifically used that to study the design of a lot of the Darkner characters. Nothing really called to me until I pulled up Queen Deltarune and I couldn't. Could I? No, I couldn't. By using her as a reference, things seemed to finally fall into place after that. By modifying Gnosis' standing pose and giving him some high heels, what had previously been a very static sprite was now turned into something that had a lot of personality. This very quickly cemented itself as Gnosis' Darkner design in my mind, and I was able to quickly put together the rest of his sprites after that. The first video he debuted in was my Art of Escapism essay, and I knew that he needed no further poking or updates or anything of the sort when people already started to comment on how charming they found him. But Max, who's that guy on the thumbnail? I am so glad you asked. That is Meowlian. Now, Meowlian was designed for a similar purpose, but with a different intended outcome. If Gnos was designed specifically to be distinct, charming, and recognizable, Meowlian was designed for one purpose and one purpose only: sitting there and looking cute. During his creation, I would frequently refer to him as my marketable plushie. Funnily enough, Meowlian had more humble origins. During Art Fight one year, I had filled out one of those about the artist character sheets, and things had been going well until I realized that I didn't have anything to put in the actual artist section. And since Art Fight is full of furries, I decided to follow suit and slapped on the fastest little scribble of a cat that I could onto there, adding on a little bat as a bow tie because I figured that perhaps I could reuse the character for something Halloween-y down the line given his stark, dark appearance. I quickly became enamored with the little thing and started shoving doodles of him as a shorthand for myself onto anything that I could. That leads into another tip. Make your Sona easy for you to draw. If you are specifically using them to represent yourself, odds are you're going to end up drawing the thing hundreds of times over the course of your life. So unless you can think of a really convincing shorthand for that mecha or those very complex earrings you want to do, mayhaps save that for a special occasion. Your fans, and most importantly, your hands, will thank you. Luckily enough for Meowlian, because of his simplicity, iterating upon him was fairly easy. In a video that I ended up making for my brother's birthday, which ended up featuring a good handful of ROCs, shout out to Everett and Info, I ended up experimenting with this really clean, lineless style that I've ended up defaulting for Meowlian ever since. He's simple enough that I can get away with using this more complex kind of art style, but it ends up making him look a bit unique, I'd say. And it's all been downhill from there. One of the really fun things about character creation, though, is trying to figure out how far you can push changing things about a character's appearance before they start to feel like a completely separate character. I haven't finalized his Lightner or Undertale designs yet, but I like to think that in the Light World, Gnos is specifically the town janitor, who has a couple shifts at Sans' Combini and then switches to cleaning up the school after all the kids have gone home for the day. Was this solely based off of an out-of-context joke that I had made that Penumbra Phantasm would end up being the school janitor? Maybe. Was I going to let it stop me from thinking about how funny it would be to make my poor little kitty Sona work a non-traditional 9-to-5? Absolutely not. And his Undertale variant doesn't seem to be doing that much better. While he does have a job as a pharmacist, he also has a small chance of becoming a Gaster follower and showing up in the True Lab. Little stuff like that. He is most certainly going to have to be poked at again when it comes to giving him a more cohesive look when it comes to design conventions for some of my original species, but to highlight just how versatile he is, I did take the liberty of redesigning him specifically for the thumbnail of my Earthbound video. As I was figuring out how I wanted to do the background for that, it did give me a chance to sit down and think about what a more humanoid version of Nos would look like, especially in this setting. While Earthbound does have a bit of a wacky premise, it's grounded in it being a commentary about living and growing up in the 90s in America with some Japanese influences. As such, while I would be able to keep Nos as a young adult, he would have to fall in line with some of these conventions. I took advantage of what I knew of late 80s and early 90s fashion trends, especially for someone who was leaning but not quite fully into the punk scene. I figured that if this was a character that would actually have existed at the time of Earthbound's release, he would probably have been the spiritual successor to Mother One's Teddy, a punk who ended up becoming one of Ninten's party members for a while. That meant that I had to fall in line too. I like to imagine that he was hired specifically by Ness and Paula to escort Jeff from Winters, and he is not thrilled about having to be stuck on what he thinks of as glorified babysitting, but the money is way too good to turn down. If I wasn't on such a fast deadline for the video to come out, I may have even delved specifically into the town of Threed's aesthetic, which is a place in the game that is simply overrun with puppets and zombies, and has this overwhelmingly macabre vibe. As it is, though, he serves his purpose well as a character meant to specifically stand out in Winters, which is a place with a overwhelmingly teal color palette. Know when to quit. Sometimes it's best to just put the marker tool down, step away, and move on to the next thing. If you ever want to revisit the character in the future, you've already gone through all this process of figuring out what doesn't work for you, so you can spend that time trying to learn what does. It was what I had ended up doing the first times I was designing Nos and Meowlian, and because I had let them sit for a bit, I couldn't be happier with the results. I can't wait to feature them both more on my channel, and perhaps, one day, I may even share with you the story that they were originally designed to take place in. But that's another video for another day. For now, I'll leave you with this. Life is hard and life is short, and if you spend the entire time designing a character trying to figure out whether or not they come across as cringe to people, then you are not going to have very much fun as a character artist. At the end of the day, there is nothing wrong with a bit of harmless self-indulgence, especially if the end result is something that's supposed to make you happy above everybody else. While both of these characters were designed with an audience in mind, first and foremost, they were made for me to express myself to people. And I wouldn't be able to express my true self to people if I had spent all that time worrying about whether or not it was a little silly to portray myself as a kitty cat. So sit down, grab a pencil, and start daydreaming about making your own self-insert. Have a nice day, and remember to have fun. You deserve it. Bye! You want to say hello? You want to say hello to the people? Oh, big jump. Don't do that.